But praise the Lord. So that's been my couple weeks. So I'm back. I'm ready. You guys ready for the word this morning? We're in our series Edify. And man, Jordan did a great job last week talking about this whole idea of when we're weak, that God is strong. How many know that sometimes the world looks at weakness and they sort of divide people up, who's the weak, and they look to see who's weak so that they can sort of take advantage of the weak. But the good news is God doesn't take advantage of the weak. God comes in on behalf of the weak and says, no, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be in process. It's okay to be wrestling, and I'm going to be strong no matter what. I'm going to be there for you. And so that's a beautiful thing. Amen? Today I'm going to take us in a little different direction than some of the last couple of weeks. We're still going to talk about Edify, and hopefully this will be encouraging to you. But the first couple of weeks here, we've talked about, the love of God, and we've talked about having hope. And last week, Jordan talked about what it looks like to be weak and allow God to be strong and not be afraid of the weaknesses that we have. And today I want to kind of take us towards a narrative story of the Old Testament, and my hope is that it will bring some hope to you and some encouragement to you. Now, I was in Colorado, and we were at this pastor's conference, and we were worshiping together, and John Egan was singing a song that's on his newest album they recently released, and it's called The Table. And the chorus is like, I have a seat at the table of the Lord, right? So he's sort of singing this deal of like this seat at the table of the Lord, and I'm standing there, and I'm just really sensed in my heart like, this is the direction we need to go on Sunday. We need to talk about what it looks like to sit at the table of the Lord. And my favorite Old Testament story about the table of the Lord is a very obscure story. So I want to talk about that this morning. Is that okay? Because here's what I feel like. I feel like sometimes we question our ability to sit at God's table. Maybe even like from last week, we think about our own weaknesses and our own struggles and the things that we're going through. Like, do I really belong at the table? Do I really have a place? I may grow up in a family where you had a kid's table and an adult's table. And, sometimes it's so bad, like you actually became adult, but you're still relegated to the kid's table. You know what I mean? Like or maybe they let you sit at the adult's table, but you don't really have a voice at the adult's table. You're just like, you're here, but you're not really, so stop talking. Sometimes we feel like we don't belong at the table. And I think a lot of times that might happen because of things that have happened to us. I talked about this story, it's been a few years ago now, but when I talked about it the last time, we had just gotten back from Lake Tahoe. And the first day we rolled into Lake Tahoe as a vacation, as a family. It was like one of the first times we had taken a family vacation in a while. And we were going to go to Lake Tahoe, and then we were going to drop JoJo off at college. And so we roll into Lake Tahoe, and we're like, we forgot a couple of things. So we roll down into town, we park right outside of Nordstrom's Rack. You think that would be okay, right? You think that, most people going into Nordstrom's Rack are not robbing people. But we park outside of Nordstrom's Rack. I'm not quite high enough for Nordstrom's, but Rack is okay. It's just a little bit above Target. So we pull in and we park outside. Just trying to get it rolling here. It's been a week, so I'm a little rusty. So we park and we roll inside, and we're only inside for a few minutes. And all of a sudden somebody runs in, it's like, hey, somebody's breaking into cars out here. So I'm like, oh man, I'll run out. And there's nothing I love more than a good chase, like a good opportunity for potentially a fight. And so I'm Irish. I'm sorry if that offends you. It's just who I am. So I'm outside like, let's go. Who is it? And I'm looking around to see whose car got broken into. I'm driving a Honda Pilot. It is not worth much. It's not really the car that I would break into if I were a thief. But somebody smashed out our passenger window and snatched my wife's purse. She had left it on the floorboard in the car. That's how we started our vacation. All of a sudden, we were like this victim of circumstance. Like we didn't do anything wrong. We locked the doors, blah, blah, blah. And somebody had taken advantage of us. And that's pretty, minuscule issue, right? You got to cancel a few cards or whatever. It's not that big of a deal. But I wonder sometimes how often do we become victims of circumstance? Things out of our control happen to us. And they're so painful, they're so difficult, that it actually shifts our identity. And we begin to live in a place of obscurity where we feel like nobody really knows what I'm going through. Nobody really knows what's happening in my life. And that's kind of what this story reveals to us. Now, I want to start with this beautiful quote from Bob Goff. He said this: God hasn't overlooked our pain. Isn't that good news? God hasn't overlooked our pain. He hasn't misunderstood our confusion. He hasn't forgotten what brings us joy. And for being honest, I think sometimes we come to seasons in our life where we wonder, God, have you forgotten me? Have you forgotten what brings me joy? I mean, this season has been pretty difficult. Do you remember me, God? Bob Goff here is telling us and encouraging us that he hasn't forgotten what brings us joy. And he finishes this quote with, he pursues us with love. And what I want to talk about this morning is this one particular character in the Old Testament. And I want to talk about the kindness of God as shown to Mephibosheth. It's a really odd name. He's actually not talked about much in the Old Testament. He gets really one chapter and a couple references before that one chapter. And one chapter is in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And I kind of want to tell the story of Mephibosheth and what it means for you and me. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, it starts off this, and David, how many know King David, the story of King David? David's a pretty well-known character. We're going to hear about David, a little bit about Saul, Jonathan, and Mephibosheth. David said, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? That's chapter 9, verse 1. David has just become king. And in becoming king, David has this element of his heart, this piece of his heart that is connected to Jonathan. Jonathan is the son of Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. Israel said, we want to have a king like all the other nations. God's like, I'm your king. They're like, we don't want you to be our king. We want a king like everybody else. And so God allows them to have a king, and they choose for themselves Saul because he's head and shoulders above the right. And this guy's bright. He's brilliant. Let's go, Saul, right? And so they pick Saul, and Saul becomes their king. But Saul doesn't have a heart after God. And Saul quickly loses sight of God, placing him in this kingdom as the king. And instead of leading with a heart after God, he begins to sort of lead after his own desires. And sure enough, quickly enough, he disobeys God, and the kingdom essentially is stripped from his hands. God tells him, like, look, through the prophet Samuel, he tells him, like, look, this kingdom is no longer yours. I'm raising up another. Now, Saul does not know this yet, but God is raising up David. David's out in the fields. David has all of these brothers. David's the youngest of his family. David's a nobody shepherd boy. But God is preparing David to become king of Israel. And I can't spend enough time on this that I would like to. Like, we would be here all afternoon. There's a lot around this idea of David. But this story really isn't about David. This story is about Mephibosheth. But you have to know a little bit about this. So David, he's slayed. He's out protecting his father's sheep. Like, he's taking on lion. Like, David likes a good fight too. Okay, like, he's like, I saw a lion snatch up one of my dad's sheep, and I went after that lion. Like, that's legit stuff. David goes after a bear, not just a lion, he goes after a bear. Like, he slayed a lion and a bear in protection of his sheep. You remember the story of David, right? David comes out to bring his brothers lunch. They're in Saul's army. The Philistines have gathered, and they're like in this sort of standoff, and the Philistines are sending out Goliath, and they're saying, hey, just send one person to come fight Goliath, and whoever wins, blah, blah, blah. And all of Israel's like afraid. They're all in their armor. They look good. They look like they might be ready to fight, but ain't none of them ready to fight. They're all afraid of Goliath. David shows up with cheese and crackers for his brothers. And he's like, what is this guy saying about our God? And so all of a sudden, David finds himself in this sort of righteous indignation about what Goliath is saying about God. And David's like, why are all these warriors just standing around? David's like, fine, I'll take him. I'll fight him. I'm paraphrasing this if you didn't know. A lot. Saul tries to give David his armor, like, here, wear my armor. If you're going to go into battle, you probably need a sword, and like, that seems legit. And he's like, I can't wear this stuff. I don't know this stuff. He goes and picks up 5 smooth stones from the brook. This is what David knows. He has a sling. He knows how to use a sling and some stones. And he takes these 5 stones and he goes out and he goes after Goliath. And you know the story, right? He defeats Goliath. He beats Goliath. And Saul is impressed with David, and Saul begins to bring David into his house. Because David's a warrior. All these other guys. There were some promises made, like whoever defeats Goliath, you have my daughter in marriage. Like there's promises are made, and David defeats Goliath. But here's the problem. Saul is a pretty insecure leader. And Saul's not a big fan of the fact that everybody is celebrating David and not Saul. And so the moment that David shows up on the scene in the kingdom of Saul, Saul has all of these insecurities that are rising up. The people are making songs like, David is killed, or Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his 10,000s. And Saul's like, what's this all about? I'm the king. And so he's not happy with this deal. Now, Saul has a son who's the apparent heir of the throne. This is how kingdoms work, right? You have a son so that your son can take your throne. Saul has a son, and the son's name is Jonathan. When David comes before Saul and Saul makes this idea that David is going to be a part of his kingdom, David speaks, Jonathan hears, and here's what Jonathan says in 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 5. He says, as soon as David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. That's important to understand. He made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all of the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now, Saul begins to chase after David because, again, everybody is excited about David. Nobody's excited about Saul. And so Saul's jealousy begins to be enraged against David. And so he pursues to kill or to take David's life. But here's Jonathan, the son of Saul, and his heart is so captured by David. Their friendship is so great that Jonathan, in the very moment, says, you know what? My king's robe, my robe of royalty, my sword, my belt, my shield, my bow, all of these things that would signify that I am the heir apparent to the throne, I give them, I willingly take them off and give them to you, David. This is how much Jonathan loved David. As the scripture says, he comes into a covenant with David. His dad is trying to kill David, and Jonathan's like, man, I love David. Talk about some family dynamics. And so as Saul is setting out to take David's life, Jonathan becomes a key character who intervenes for David. And they cut this covenant. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 15 and 16, it says this. Jonathan says, if I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. So Jonathan is so knit to David, and Jonathan knows, he's aware that David is probably the heir apparent now. He's actually given up his right to be the heir apparent to David. And he knows that Saul, the king, is after David and does not want David around. He wants to take his life. And Saul sort of intervenes in the middle. Jonathan intervenes in the middle, but he sort of makes this covenant with David, and he says to David, if I'm still alive, when this all goes down, when you become king, when all of your enemies are handled, he's talking about his father as well. If I'm still alive, please show your steadfast kindness to me. Please show me favor. Please restore or reciprocate this love to me, which is what a covenant is. It's a two-way reciprocation. So, the story goes that Saul, Jonathan, they go out to war against the Philistines. The Philistines wouldn't let David fight with them. He tried to fight with them, but the Philistines wouldn't let him fight with them. Saul and Jonathan go out to war with the Philistines, and they're killed, both of them in the same day, in war against the Philistines. And because they're killed and all this stuff, over a process of time, David is elevated to now be the king over Israel. And this is where we get to this point in 2 Samuel 9 when he becomes a king, and he says, is there anybody still left of the house of Saul that I might show kindness for Jonathan's sake? It's like, is there anybody left who is a part of the house of Saul that I might bestow kindness upon them because of the covenant that I made with Jonathan? Now, David wept over the death of Saul and Jonathan. We'll pick up back in 2 Samuel chapter 9. It says, now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I might show the kindness of God to him? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. So David all of a sudden gets wind that there is an heir of Jonathan, a son of Jonathan. Jonathan, the one who gave up his right to the throne. Jonathan, the one who betrayed even his father for the sake of saving David's life. And Jonathan has a son who is still alive. But he's paralyzed in his feet. He's crippled in his feet. We find out why this happened in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. It says, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. Saul and Jonathan go out to war. Word comes back that they've been killed in war. This poor caretaker, with the greatest of intentions, scoops up Mephibosheth, who's only 5 years old at this time. And she goes to flee with him, to find a place of refuge, to find a place where they can hide out. Because, how wars go, at least in this time, is that when a king was killed, they would come and take out his entire family, lest there be a rebellion, a rising up against the new king. And so surely they're coming not just for Jonathan and Saul, but surely they're coming to wipe out the entire family. So she scoops him up and she goes to flee away. And as she's fleeing, as she's running away, she trips, she stumbles, whatever happens, she drops Mephibosheth. And he's crippled. Think about Mephibosheth for a moment. He's only 5. And all of a sudden, in one moment, he goes from being an heir to the throne of Israel to being an orphan and a crippled, paralyzed, more than likely beggar in a moment. None of it his fault. None of it because of something that he did or did not do. And see, I find my story oftentimes in the story of Mephibosheth. I don't know about you, but I've had situations that have happened to me in my life that have left me breathless. Moments in my life where everything seemed like it was going great, and then all of a sudden, it's as if everything fell apart in a moment. Now, I'm healthy, I'm alive, I have 2 healthy sons, I have a healthy marriage, I have a lot of healthy things, so my things are very minimal comparatively, right? But we all have our stories. We all are living our lives accordingly, and everybody's probably experienced in this room something that has taken your breath away, a victim of circumstance, like Mephibosheth. And he's known now as basically the son of Jonathan who is crippled, paralyzed by the past. Anybody in here ever been paralyzed by your past? Things that have happened to you. Maybe you had nothing to do with it. Maybe you did have something to do with it. Maybe you made some really bad decisions. I've done that too. Come on, I can be in either camp. Let's go. I've had bad things done to me and I've done dumb things. Life-changing moments that can paralyze us. Mephibosheth now, he is lame in his feet, both physically, literally lame in his feet, but also think about what has happened to him emotionally, what has happened to him spiritually. Not just paralyzed in his legs, but can you imagine the trauma that this 5-year-old is experiencing in the moment that he finds out his father, his grandfather have died in war, and then he's dropped and paralyzed instantly. A victim of circumstance, and he did not choose this lot in life. In that moment, he loses his family, he loses his favor with the kingdom. He's no longer an heir to the throne, obviously. And he winds up in this place called Lodabar. Everybody say Lodabar. I don't know why I wanted you to say that, but it just, make sure you're still with me. He winds up in this place called Lodabar, which means a dry place. That's literally what that name means, a dry place, a desolate place, a place of obscurity. Place of ambiguity. He's not known by anybody. Nobody cares about Mephibosheth. Maybe his caretaker took him to this place purposefully so that nobody would know him, so that he could just kind of blend in and be a nobody in this dry and desolate place. But this is where he is in Lodabar, this dry, desolate place, this place of obscurity. And he spent 17 to 18 years living in Lodabar. 17 to 18 years of total obscurity, and his identity now, more than likely we will see, is attached to the fact that he's just a nobody, that he is paralyzed, that he is lame, that his lot in life has really done him dirty, like he has nothing to live for. You can imagine 17 or 18 years sitting at the doorway looking out at everybody else living their life, and all you have is maybe an opportunity to beg for some food, maybe an opportunity to beg for some shelter, maybe an opportunity to beg for some peace and comfort. But none of those things come. How many times does he play over the 17 to 18 years? How many times does he replay in his mind that he at one point was the heir to the throne? Can you imagine his caretaker even tell him the stories? You got to know, Mephibosheth, your father was a wonderful man. Your grandfather was king. Not as wonderful, but telling him stories, this is what your heritage was. And here he is, stuck. Ziba tells David, there's still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. His name is Mephibosheth. And he's living in this place of obscurity. And when David calls for Ziba, and Ziba says, look, there's somebody. He's now 22, 23 years old. Mephibosheth is. He was 5 when all this happened to him. He's now 22, 23 years old. And for me, I have to remind myself regularly that what has happened to me has made me who I am, but I am not what has happened to me. Does that make me sense? Let me say it like this. What has happened to you has made you who you are, but you are not what has happened to you. And I can imagine after 17, 18 years of not being able to walk, not being able to live and flourish in life, Mephibosheth is probably feeling like he has become what has happened to him. His identity is wrapped up in the fact that he once was, but now is. And how often does that happen to us? That what has happened to us has become who we are. That we too have become paralyzed by the past, emotionally, spiritually, physically. That our identities have been wrapped up in what has happened to us, to the circumstances of our life. But the good news is here is we'll see that we are not what has happened to us. Dr. Eric Mason said this. He said, be careful of letting a season of pain and hurt make you think that these are all your journey with God is made of. Be careful of letting a season of pain and hurt make you think that this pain and hurt, this is your experience, and this is all that your journey is made of, pain and hurt. How many know that that can be a case? Has anybody been in a long, dry season? Mephibosheth, 17 to 18 years of Lodabar, long, dry season of obscurity. Surely he was thinking to himself, this is all there is to life. But then all of a sudden, he receives the call. We pick up in 2 Samuel, it says this, the king said to Ziba, where is he? And Ziba said, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar. And then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell on his face, and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And Mephibosheth paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Oh, there. You see the identity issue here? Mephibosheth knows his place in all of this. But listen, he's paralyzed by his past, but what he doesn't recognize is he's been pursued by the king. And David says, Mephibosheth, right? Mephibosheth hears, Mephibosheth. There's a difference. David has summoned him because he wants to show him kindness. But Mephibosheth knows how the game is played. Mephibosheth knows that every new king does one thing that every single king does, and that is to eliminate the ancestors of the former king so that there will be no rebellion. Matter of fact, David has already dealt with some of the rebellion of Mephibosheth's uncle, Isosheth, why do they name these people this way? Isoshebeth or something like that. He's his uncle who actually tried to rise up against David, and David had to squash the rebellion. So Mephibosheth, surely he knows or feels that, first of all, I am the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, whom David has taken the kingdom from. And so even if I was healthy, he wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. But secondary, I am also lame, and so therefore I am worth nothing to anybody. I'm just a dead dog. But David has pursued him. He's afraid that he might lose his life. And David says, listen, I want to show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. Covenant kindness. Here's what I see in this. I see that in this Old Testament story, the kindness of God. See, Jesus says in the New Testament that all of the scriptures are about him. They're all pointing towards him, right? And God is revealing himself through all of the Old Testament. All of these obscure stories, God is revealing his nature and his character and who he is. And these people like David, who was a person just like, he had his faults. Y'all know what I'm saying? David had some issues. Anybody know what I'm talking about? David had some problems. But in this story, what we are seeing is what the kindness of God looks like towards people. Wayward, broken people. And David is a type and shadow of God. David is a type and shadow of Christ and the goodness and kindness of Christ. Mephibosheth is a type and shadow of you and me and all of broken society. We all have experienced sinfulness, brokenness, separation from God, separation from the King, living in obscurity in our sin, in a dry and desolate place. Yet, the King pursues us. David didn't have to do anything. David didn't even know that there was anybody left in the house of Saul. But David, with a heart for Jonathan, says, is there anybody in the family? And he pursues Mephibosheth because of his covenant with Jonathan. God pursues us because he made a covenant a long time ago when he made us in his image that he would indeed redeem us, that he would come after us, that he would make a way that we could be again with him. He says, I want to show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. This covenant kindness, this word kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. Everybody, don't say it. I was going to say, everybody say hesed, but don't say hesed. I don't know why we do that as preachers. We get in this thing, everybody say, like, are you still with me? It's the Hebrew word hesed, and it literally has this meaning of loving faithfulness. If you move it from the Hebrew into the New Testament in Greek, it's the word grace. This loving faithfulness, and David is showing forth this loving faithfulness, this kindness to Mephibosheth because of the covenant that he struck with his dad, Jonathan. The scriptures tell us it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. The kindness of God that leads us to repentance. You know, you see some people and you wouldn't think that it's the kindness of God at all. You would think that God is always angry. Anybody? Mephibosheth thinks that David is angry. Mephibosheth thinks that David has called him to the kingdom for the sake of a couple of things. Perhaps he will imprison him for the rest of his life. Maybe he'll make him a slave. That's happened as well. Or, worst of all, he will just execute him for being the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, and an apparent heir to the throne. Technically speaking, Mephibosheth has claim to that throne. And Mephibosheth is thinking, perhaps these three things is why the king has called me before him. But all of a sudden he finds out that he's not there because he's a dog or a dead dog. He's there because David loved his dad. He's there because David wanted to show him the kindness, the covenant loyalty that he had to his dad, the hesed kindness of the Lord. And that's us. This is what Jesus came to do for us. When Jesus shows up on the scene, the scriptures tell us that we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, right? This is in John chapter 1, like verses 14, 15. The only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That Jesus came to reveal to us in flesh and blood what the Father is actually like. And when we get all kinds of misunderstandings, misguided conceptions of what God is like, which had happened, still happens, we think that God's angry and that God's mad and he's come to judge us. No, he came to bestow grace upon us. And Jesus shows us that. It's like David begins to show Mephibosheth this kindness of the Lord. You, my friends, are being pursued by the King in spite of your past. Not only are you not what has happened to you, and that you can have freedom from that past. You don't have to be paralyzed by that past. But also, recognize that you are being pursued by the King of Kings. Just as David went after Mephibosheth, God, through Christ, is coming after us. Isn't that good news? So then he says, like, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? And then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, listen to this, like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So here's a man who was paralyzed by his past, a victim of circumstance, living in total obscurity. But the king came calling. The king pursued him, called him into his presence. And then he positioned him at the table. I was at this conference and we were just worshiping. I have a seat at the table of the Lord. And this is the story that just kept playing through my mind, that Lord, you have allowed me to sit at your table. In my brokenness, despite or in spite of all of the stupid things that I've done and all the stupid things that have happened to me, you pursued me. And not only did you pursue me, see, he could have pursued Mephibosheth and just made him a servant, made him a slave in his kingdom. He goes, I'll just give you some land. I'll just give you some, pay some reparations for what happened to your father and your grandfather and sort of let you do your thing. He didn't just do that. He said, no. I want you to sit at my table as if you were my own son. He was positioned at the table. Here's what Mephibosheth's name means. It means dispeller of shame. Think about that. He probably had no idea when all of this went down that his very name was prophesying to him that there will come a day when the shame that you feel will be broken off of you. When you will have the opportunity once again, instead of living this shameful, obscure life in Lodabar, that you'll be called into the very presence of the king and seated at his table and treated as one of his very own sons. Dispeller of shame. And see, this is what we have to understand. This is the story of God working through these Old Testament stories, that God is longing to come to us who are broken and paralyzed and in our sinfulness. And he is longing to pursue us so that he can show the loving kindness that he feels towards us, so that he can call us to the table of the Lord to know him. Now, we don't spend a lot of time at tables anymore. At least in our homes, they tend to be like sort of pushed up against walls. And it used to be that the table was like the centerpiece of the home. I'm not making an indictment on culture, it just kind of is what it is. But especially during this time, like only the most intimate of friends or family could actually sit at the table. Everybody doesn't get a seat at the table. For David, the king, to make a call for someone who should be his enemy, who has nothing to offer him, he says, I want you to sit at my table as if you were my own son. This is what the kingdom of God does for us. That God, through Christ Jesus, opened up a seat at the table for you and me. Not as servants, but as sons and daughters, as his very own, you have a seat at the table. And let me share a few things of what the table is, and then we're going to worship here. The table is a place of favor. All of a sudden, Mephibosheth goes from complete obscurity, nobody, nothing, dead dog in his own view, to a place of total favor with the king. The table is a place of sufficiency. He says, I want Mephibosheth to sit at my table. He will eat all the time at my, that means he will never lack. It doesn't matter. I'm giving him crops and Ziba, you and your family, you care for us. Make sure he has produce. But even if he doesn't, even if his crops fail, doesn't matter. He's sitting at my table, and my table is sufficient. There will always be more than enough at my table. The table is a place of honor. Everybody in that room, everybody in the kingdom had to have heard the story of Mephibosheth, had to have heard the fact that Mephibosheth was now sitting as a son at the table of David, and therefore he deserved the honor as such. The table is a place of intimacy, as I said earlier. This is where the deepest conversations took place. This is where people knew that you were a part of the family when you were able to sit at the table. This is why it was so controversial, the people that Jesus ate with. Yeah, remember, this is why the religious folks got so upset at Jesus regularly, because he sat at tables with sinners. They accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard. Why would you accuse him of such things? Because he's eating with such. He's eating with tax collectors. He's eating with prostitutes. I mean, if he's associating with these people, surely he also is one of these people. It was so controversial for Jesus to sit at these tables. Why? Because the table is a place of intimacy. And Jesus was tearing down all of this, what he came to do. He came for the sick. He came to tear down the barriers. He came to make a way for the marginalized and the broken and the hurting, the ones that society has cast off. And Jesus is hanging out with them. The Messiah is hanging out. He should be hanging out with the religious people in the temple. He's like, no, I want to hang out with the broken people because they're the ones that I came to redeem. Of course, all of them were broken. They just didn't realize it. The table is a place of family. I love it that David doesn't just say, you will always eat at my table, but that you will always eat at my table as if you were my son, in effect saying, because you are my son. It's a place of family. And God has invited us to come at the table because he wants us to be a part of his family. And he's not calling us oftentimes like we think. He's not going, Mephibosheth. You all know that sound, right? Remember when you were younger? For some of us a little bit longer than others, but remember when we were younger and our parents called our name, we could tell, we could differentiate what was going on by how they said our name. Right? You're like, Ryan Michael Day! This is problems. My middle name was included in this. I should not come home. I did not hear that. Right? Some of you are like, your middle name is Michael? Yes. But you could tell by the tone what was happening. The tone of God towards us is not this, I'm angry with you. The tone of God is, I want you. Come sit at my table. In my family. Because of God's kindness, you have a seat at the table. And I want to encourage you this morning to take your seat. Some of you are standing back in the corner like, I'm not sure if I belong. I hear you, preacher, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure that, if you knew really what's going on in my life, what I've done, where I've been, if you knew kind of what I'm thinking or whatever, I don't think God wants me. Yes, you. Not because of your goodness, not because of how well you have lived life, but because of his goodness and his kindness. He's offering you a seat at his table. And I want to encourage you to take your seat as a child of the King. Leif Hetland, he said this: take a moment and reflect on the goodness and loving kindness of our Father. He says to you, everything I have is yours.